Rosalind. The dawn breaks, and with it, hope anew.
Hope of Evrith.
Always for you.
The gravestone read, Lady Rosalind Ashworth, beloved daughter, taken too soon, 1821. It had stood in the Ashworth family cemetery for 3 years. The roses planted at its base had already grown wild, climbing the stone like they were trying to hold on to something. The inscription had been carved by the finest stonecutter in all of London. The funeral had been attended by half the ton. Tears had been shed. Black had been worn. The Duke of Ravermore had stood at the edge of that grave with his jaw so tight it looked carved from the same stone. And he had not cried. Not once. He had not cried because he had not believed it. Not from the very first day. But 3 years is a long time to keep fighting a truth that everyone around you has already accepted. 3 years is long enough that even the most stubborn heart begins to wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was wrong. And so by the autumn of 1824, when the golden leaves were falling over the hills of the Ravemore estate in Northumberland, the Duke of Ravemore, Edmund Calloway, the youngest duke in all of England, cold as winter water and twice as proud, had finally, quietly, begun to let go. He had not announced it. He was not the kind of man who announced things. He had simply stopped sleeping in the chair beside his study window, the chair from which, on clear nights, he could see the road that wound down from the northern hills. He had simply stopped looking up every time a carriage passed. He had simply, on a Tuesday morning in October, asked his housekeeper to remove the portrait of Rosalind Ashworth from the main hall and put it somewhere he would not have to walk past it every single day. That was how close he was to letting go. And then he rode into the Thornwood. It was not supposed to be anything more than a hunting trip. His estate manager, Mr. Dobbins, had suggested it weeks ago. The deer population in the northern stretch of the Thornwood Forest had grown too large. The farmers at the edge of the property were complaining, and the Duke needed something to do with himself, besides brood and refuse dinner invitations. Edmund had agreed with a particular brand of agreement that meant he did not care one way or another, but would go anyway because disagreeing required more energy than simply going. He rode out on the morning of the 3rd of October with 2 of his gamekeepers, a man named Hatch and a man named Fossey. They entered the forest just as the sun was cutting sideways through the trees, orange and thin, throwing long shadows across the frost-stiff grass. The Thornwood in autumn was a beautiful and slightly menacing thing. The trees were old here, older than the estate, older than the title of Ravemore itself. The oaks were enormous, their roots breaking through the ground like the knuckles of buried giants. The path narrowed quickly once you passed the first mile marker, and after the 2nd mile there was no real path at all. Just trees, and silence, and the sound of your horses breathing. They had been riding for perhaps an hour when Hatch's horse shied. Edmund pulled up. His own horse, a dark gray stallion named Caspian, was already tense beneath him, ears pressed flat. "What is it?" Edmund asked. "Don't know." "Your Grace," Hatch said, fighting his horse's attempts to turn back the way they'd come. Something spooked him. Fossey was pointing through the trees. There, he said. Something moved. Edmund looked. At first he saw nothing, just trees and undergrowth and the pale morning light filtering through the canopy. Then his eyes adjusted, found the shape of it, and he went absolutely, completely still. There was a figure crouching beside the trunk of a great oak, perhaps 40 yards away. It was a person. A woman, he realized, though it took a moment because she was draped in what appeared to be layers of rough cloth and animal skin, and her hair was long and loose, and the color of autumn itself, all deep brown and copper, tangled with leaves and what might have been small bits of bark. She was very still. She had gone still the same moment he had. She was watching him the way a deer watches, or a fox, calculating the distance and the threat and the odds. His heart did something he could not quite describe. It did not jump. It did not race. It simply stopped for just one breath, and then began again in a different rhythm. Because he knew that face. He would have known that face through walls, through fog, through 3 years and a gravestone and 100 dinner parties where he had sat and smiled and let people tell him it was time to move on. He would have known that face at the bottom of the ocean. "Rosalind," he said. He had not meant to say it out loud. He had meant to stay very still, to think, to be logical, to be Edmund Calloway, the Duke of Ravemore, who was never caught off guard, never rattled, never stood in the middle of a forest with his hands shaking on his reins because a ghost was crouching 40 yards away, wearing animal skins and looking at him like she was deciding whether to run. She ran. She moved so fast it was almost shocking. Up and gone in an instant. Disappearing into the undergrowth with a speed and sureness that spoke of someone who knew these woods the way other people knew their own drawing rooms. Edmund was already urging Caspian forward before he had made the conscious decision to do it. Behind him he heard Hatch shout something. He did not stop. He rode hard, ducking branches, following the flicker of her through the trees, and he might have lost her a dozen times except that some part of him had always known where she was, the way a compass always knows north, and after perhaps 3 minutes of the most reckless riding he had done since he was 17 years old, he burst into a small clearing and pulled Caspian up short. She was there. She had stopped running. She was standing in the center of the clearing with her back to a great fallen oak, and she was facing him, and she had something in her hand that it took him a moment to recognize as a knife. A small one, worn and plain, but a knife nonetheless. Her chest was heaving. Her eyes were enormous, gray eyes, the color of storm clouds over the sea. He had written poetry about those eyes once, terrible poetry, the kind you write when you are 23, and so desperately in love you cannot see straight, and you never show anyone because you have a reputation to maintain. He had burned the poetry. He remembered every word. "Stay back," she said. Her voice was rough, like a door that had not been opened in a long time, but it was her voice. Every syllable of it. "Rosalind," he said again, and this time his voice came out strange, low and raw, in a way that would have embarrassed him if he had been capable of feeling embarrassment in this moment, which he was not. She flinched when he said her name, actually flinched like it hurt her. "You have the wrong person," she said. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. The knife in her hand, the animal skins, the leaves in her hair, the way she held herself, half crouched, ready to bolt again, ready to fight if she had to. And underneath all of that, underneath 3 years of wildness and survival, the face he had memorized before he ever knew he was memorizing it. "I do not have the wrong person," he said. She pressed back against the fallen oak. "I don't know who you are. I don't know anyone called Rosalind. You need to leave." Edmund got down from his horse. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way you move around something that might bolt or bite. He kept his eyes on her. He let Caspian's reins drop because the horse would stay without them. He took 2 steps toward her and then stopped. "My name is Edmund Calloway," he said, "Duke of Ravemore, and you are Lady Rosalind Ashworth, daughter of the late Earl of Ashworth, and you have been declared dead for 3 years." He paused. "There is a gravestone with your name on it in my family cemetery. I planted the roses myself." Something crossed her face, something painful and complicated, there for just a moment before she locked it away. "You're wrong," she said, but her voice cracked on the second word. "Rosalind." He took one more step, close enough now to see the faint scar along her left jaw that had not been there before. Close enough to see that she was thinner than she should be, close enough to see that her hands were trembling, though the hand holding the knife was steadier than the other. "I am not wrong, and I think you know I am not wrong." She looked at him. For a long moment she just looked at him, and he let her, standing in the clearing in the thin October sunlight, not moving, not demanding, just standing there with his heart doing that strange new rhythm. "I can't go back," she said finally. It was barely a whisper. "Why not?" Her jaw tightened. "Because I'm dead," she said. "You said so yourself. I have a gravestone. Gravestones can be removed. Some things can't be." He did not understand what she meant. Not yet. But he was watching her face, and he could see that she was not mad. She was frightened. There was a difference, and he had always been good at reading people. It was one of the few gifts he had ever privately been grateful for. She was not a woman who had lost her mind to 3 years in the wilderness. She was a woman who was very deliberately afraid of something. "Will you tell me what happened?" he asked. She was quiet for a long time. The forest settled around them. Say a crow calling somewhere in the canopy, the wind moving through the upper branches, Caspian shifting his weight behind Edmund with a soft sound. "No," she said at last. "All right." She blinked. She had clearly expected an argument. "All right," he said again quietly. "Not now. But Rosalind, you cannot stay out here. It is October. The temperature drops below freezing at night. The winter will come, and you are—" He stopped himself from saying, "You are too thin. You are not well. Ah, you look like something that has survived something terrible and is still surviving it every single day. He said instead, "You will not survive the winter out here alone." "I have survived 2 already," she said, and there was a flash of something almost like pride in it. "I know," he said, "and I don't doubt it. But you don't have to survive a 3rd. She looked at him for another long moment. Then, very slowly, she lowered the knife. It was not an agreement. He knew it was not an agreement. But it was something. It was the first small crack in the wall she had built around herself out here in Thornwood, and Edmund Calloway, who was patient when he needed to be and stubborn always, filed the existence of that crack away and waited. She did not come with him that day. He had not truly expected her to. He rode back out of the Thornwood as the morning turned to afternoon, with Hatch and Fossey both watching him with wide, slightly stunned expressions that he absolutely refused to acknowledge. He said nothing to them. He said nothing to anyone. He arrived back at Ravemore House, handed Caspian to the groom, walked to his study, closed the door, and stood in the middle of the room for a very long time. Then he sat down at his desk and tried to think clearly. Rosalind Ashworth was alive. She had been alive for 3 years while the world believed her dead. She was living in his forest, in the northern Thornwood, dressed in skins, carrying a knife, and she did not want to come back. She was afraid. She had said she could not come back, and there was something specific behind those words, something she was not yet willing to share. He needed to know what had happened 3 years ago. He knew the official story, of course. Everyone knew the official story. Rosalind had been travelling by carriage from London to the Ashworth estate in Yorkshire in the early winter of 1821. There had been a storm. The carriage had gone off the road on the high moor above Whitecliff Pass, tumbled down the embankment and crashed into the ravine below. The coachman had been found dead. The footman had been found dead. Of Rosalind herself, nothing had been found at all. And after a search of several weeks in the brutal December cold, the conclusion had been reached that she had been swept away by the river that ran through the bottom of the ravine, and that her body was simply unrecoverable. Edmund had never accepted it. He had not accepted it for reasons he could not entirely explain at the time, reasons that people around him had gently suggested were the product of grief and denial. He had gone to Whitecliff Pass himself and stood at the edge of the ravine and looked down at the river and thought, "She is not dead. She is not there. I would know." He had hired a private investigator, a quiet, efficient man named Pryor, and told him to find out everything he could. Pryor had found nothing. The official story held. After 2 years, Pryor had come to him and said, with great gentleness, that sometimes the river kept what it took, and that he believed the young lady was gone. Sir Edmund had paid him and thanked him, and privately kept not believing it. And now he knew why. She had survived the crash. She had walked out of that ravine alive. And instead of returning home, instead of sending word, instead of letting anyone who loved her know she was not dead, she had been living in Thornwood for 3 years, frightened of something, calling herself a nobody with the wrong name. He needed to go back. The question was how to do it without frightening her away. She was like something wild now, and you did not catch wild things by running at them. You caught wild things by being patient, by being near, by proving yourself harmless over time. Edmund had never in his adult life had to prove himself harmless. He was a duke. He was wealthy and cold, and known for a manner that made solicitors nervous and hostesses jumpy. Harmlessness was not a quality he had ever cultivated. He would have to learn. He went back the next morning, alone this time, without Hatch or Fossey. He left Caspian at the edge of the forest and walked in on foot. He brought food, a loaf of bread from the kitchen and a parcel of salt pork, wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. He went back to the clearing. She was not there. He had not expected her to be. He walked slowly around the clearing, looking. He found the fallen oak she had stood against. He found footprints, small and light, leading away into the undergrowth on the northern side. He followed them for about 100 yards before the ground hardened, and he lost the trail. He went back to the clearing and put the food down on top of the fallen oak. Then he sat down on a nearby stone and waited. Nothing happened for a long time. He was not a man who minded silence. He was, in truth, a man who preferred it. He sat on the stone and listened to the forest and watched the light move through the canopy and thought about nothing in particular. The way you can think about nothing when something so large is sitting at the back of your mind that your conscious thoughts have simply stepped back and left the room. After about 2 hours, he became aware that he was being watched. He did not look up. He remained completely still. He kept his gaze on the middle distance and said without raising his voice, "I brought bread and salt pork. You don't have to talk to me. You can take it and go. I'll be back tomorrow with more." Nothing. "I also brought this," he said, and pulled from his coat pocket a small volume he had taken from the library that morning. He held it up so the cover was visible. It was a collection of poems by William Blake, old and much handled, the spine worn soft. "I thought I would read for a while. You are welcome to stay or go as you please." He opened the book and began to read. He read for about half an hour. He read out loud, not loudly, just enough for the words to reach whoever was in the trees behind him. He read songs of innocence and then moved into songs of experience, and was about midway through the tiger when he heard, very quietly, the sound of movement. He kept reading. He did not look up. She sat down on the far end of the fallen oak. He saw it in his peripheral vision. She sat down, reached out, and took the bread. She did not say anything. He kept reading. When he finished the poem, he looked up. She was watching him with an expression he could not fully decipher. She had eaten half the bread and was holding the rest, without the knife this time, which he took as progress. "Blake," she said. "You never used to read, Blake." He had not, that was true. He had read Blake specifically because it was not something he would have chosen before, because he wanted her to see that he had changed, that 3 years had changed him, that he was not the person she perhaps remembered. "No," he agreed. "I did not." She looked at him steadily. "What do you want?" she asked. I want to understand what happened, he said. I want to understand why you are here. And then what? If I tell you, what happens? Whatever you want to happen, he said. She almost laughed. It was not a happy sound. You can't promise that. You're a duke. I am. But the forest belongs to me, and no one knows you are in it except me, which means for the moment, whatever happens is whatever you decide. She was quiet, thinking. She pulled a piece of bread apart with her fingers and ate it slowly, the way someone eats when they have spent a long time being careful about food, not rushing, not wasting. I remember you, she said at last. You came to the Ashworth house that summer. The summer before. You were... She stopped. I was courting you, he said. Badly, as I understand it. You weren't bad at it. My sister said I was terrible. She said I had the romantic sensibility of a particularly unfriendly rock. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. Lady Constance, she said softly. Is she well? She is. She is married now, as of last year, a baronet in Derbyshire. She was furious that I let her have a small wedding. He paused. She cried at your funeral. The shadow of a smile disappeared. I'm sorry, Rosalind said quietly. Don't be. It isn't your fault. He watched her. Is it? She met his eyes. That depends, she said, on what you think the fault is. He waited. She looked away, up into the canopy, and was silent for so long he thought she was done talking. Then she said, still looking up, My brother arranged it. Edmund went very still. She brought her gaze back down to him. My brother arranged the accident. He needed me dead. He needed the inheritance. My father had died the year before and left the estate in trust to me, which meant my brother couldn't touch it while I lived, couldn't sell it, couldn't mortgage it, couldn't do any of the things he had already promised various people in London he would do with it. She said this very flatly, in a voice scrubbed clean of emotion. He hired someone, 2 men. They tampered with the carriage, waited for the storm, and when the carriage went off the road, they were supposed to make certain I didn't come back up the other side of that ravine. Edmund's jaw was tight enough to hurt. But you did. The river was faster than they expected. It took me downstream before they could get to me. A very small pause. I nearly drowned. I nearly died of cold. I woke up on the bank of the river 2 miles from the crash site with a broken arm and a head injury and no real idea, for a while, of who I was or where I was. She touched the scar on her jaw. Some of that came back. Most of it came back. But by the time it did, I already knew what had happened. I found a farmer who let me shelter in his barn for a few weeks while I healed. He told me about the search parties, about my body not being found, and I thought... She stopped, started again. I thought, if they believe I'm dead, then I'm safe. Because if I go back, my brother will try again. He has more to lose now than he did then. He has the estate, the money, the position. I go back. I take all of that away. He won't let that happen. Edmund said nothing for a moment. He was working through it. He was working through the controlled fury of it and making sure that when he spoke, his voice was level. Your brother is in London, he said. I know. He has your inheritance. I know. And you have been living in my forest for 3 years rather than come forward because you are afraid of what he would do. Yes, she said simply. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment, and he thought about the gravestone with her name on it, and the roses he had planted himself, and every morning for 3 years that he had woken up and felt the absence of something he had never quite had. Rosalind, he said very quietly, you are not alone in this. She looked at him, and for just a moment her face opened, went soft and young and frightened in a way she had clearly been carefully preventing for 3 years. Then she closed it again, just as quickly. You can't fight my brother, she said. Why not? Because I am the Duke of Ravemore, Edmund said, still quiet, still level. Your brother is a viscount who gambled away your father's estate in less than a year and nearly had 2 women murdered for money. I think, if you consider it carefully, you will find the odds are not as much in his favor as he would like to believe. She stared at him. He picked up Blake's book, stood, and slipped it back into his coat pocket. I will come back tomorrow, he said, with more food. And if you would like to talk, we can talk. If you would like me to simply read to you, I can do that instead. He looked at her steadily. I am not going to rush you. I am not going to drag you back anywhere, but I would very much like for you to still be alive when spring comes. He turned and walked back through the trees. Behind him, he heard nothing at all, but when he glanced back just once at the edge of the clearing, she was still sitting on the fallen oak, watching him go. That was enough. For today, that was enough. He came back every day. He came in the mornings before his estate work began, and he always came alone and always on foot, and he always brought food. Bread and cheese, and once a whole roasted chicken wrapped in a cloth that he carried rather awkwardly, and that made her stare at him for a moment before she took it without a word. He brought other things too. A blanket, heavy wool, which he left on the fallen oak one morning when she was not in sight, and which was gone by the time he returned the next day. A pair of good leather gloves, a small pot, tin, lightweight, the kind a traveling man might carry. He did not bring these things and then mention them. He simply left them and said nothing, and she took them and said nothing. And it was understood between them that the things were there, and that they were not charity, and that no one was keeping account. He read to her every day. He had worked through 2 volumes of Blake and was now well into a novel, one of Mrs. Radcliffe's, all Gothic castles and hidden passages and women in peril, which seemed, in retrospect, perhaps not the most tactful choice given the circumstances, but which she seemed genuinely interested in. She would sit on her side of the fallen oak, and he would sit on his, and he would read. And sometimes she would interrupt to say something about the plot or a character. And they would talk for a while, and it felt, in a way that was almost absurd, ordinary. On the 6th day she told him her name, not her real name, the name she had been using. I've been called Wren, she said, while he was pouring water from the flask he always brought into the tin pot, which she had clearly been using. by the farmer and his wife, the ones who helped me when I first came out of the river. Their name was Barker. They called me Wren because I was small and quiet and wouldn't tell them who I was. Wren, he repeated. I've gotten used to it, she said. In here. She touched her temple. I am Wren in here. Rosalind feels like... She paused, searching. Like a coat I used to own. I know the shape of it. But I haven't worn it in so long. He thought about that. Perhaps you need to try it on slowly, he said, rather than all at once. She looked at him. When did you become sensible about things like that? I have always been sensible. You once told my father that you had no interest in small talk and walked out of a dinner party early because someone mentioned fox hunting, and you disagreed with them loudly enough that Lady Pemberton spilled her wine. He paused. That was a measured and considered response to a serious moral question about animal welfare. She almost smiled. It was closer than it had been before. You were 23. I was still right about fox hunting. This time she smiled small and quick, like a lamp turned up for just a moment before someone turned it down again. But it was there. He saw it. He stored it away somewhere in his chest, next to all the other small things he had been collecting this past week. On the 9th day it rained, hard, a cold, driving October rain that turned the forest floor to mud and came through the canopy in great sheets. And he arrived at the clearing to find her not there. He waited, getting thoroughly wet, until she appeared from the north side of the clearing and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and something warmer. You are soaked, she said. I am fine. You are a duke and you are standing in the rain in a forest getting soaked. I said I would come, he said simply. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Come on. Then, and turned and walked back the way she had come. He followed her. She led him through the undergrowth for about 5 minutes, deeper into the northern section of the thornwood than he had ever gone, until they reached what he could only describe as a shelter. Someone, meaning her, had built it against the base of a large rock face, using fallen branches and the rock wall itself as two sides, with a roof of interlaced branches covered with bracken and bark. It was genuinely impressive. The interior was small, barely room for 2 people to sit, but it was dry and there was a low fire pit built into the rock floor, and she had a fire going, just a small one, very efficiently built. There were skins on the floor, rolled and stacked to the side. There was a row of small clay pots she had made herself. There were dried herbs hanging from the roof branches, and a length of rope, and a folded piece of rough cloth, and the blanket he had brought her, folded neatly against one wall. He sat down. He looked around. He thought about her building all of this, alone, in the middle of winter for 2 winters. And he felt something in his chest that was not quite pain, but was close to it. You built this yourself, he said. The first winter was difficult, she said matter-of-factly, feeding a small piece of wood into the fire. I made a lot of mistakes. The second was easier. Rosalind. Wren, she said, not unkindly. He was quiet for a moment. Wren, he said. What your brother did. I know what he did. He needs to answer for it. I know that too. She sat back on her heels and looked at the fire. I've thought about it every day for 3 years. What I would do if I could. How I would make it right. But thinking and doing are very different things when the person you're afraid of has money and position and connections and can simply... She pressed her lips together. He could have declared me mad, you know. He would do exactly that. I disappeared for 3 years, living in a forest, talking to trees. A good solicitor could make that case very easily. Edmund shook his head. He could try. But there are a great many things that can be done before he has the chance. Such as? He met her eyes. Such as my solicitor going to London with a very thorough account of events. Such as a medical examination by a doctor of my choosing. One who will certify that you are in full possession of your faculties. Such as a quiet conversation between myself and 2 or 3 men in Parliament who owe me favors, before your brother is even aware you are alive. He held her gaze. Such as the Duke of Ravemore formally stating in writing that he witnessed the Lady Rosalind Ashworth alive in Northumberland on the 3rd of October, 1824, in excellent mental health, which is the sort of statement that is very difficult to argue with in any court in England. She stared at him. I have spent 3 years thinking about what I would do if I ever found you, he said quietly. I have not been entirely idle. You actually, she stopped. You thought about this, specifically. I thought it was possible, not probable, but yes. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled between them, small and steady, throwing warm light across the rock walls. Outside, the rain hammered down on the bracken roof and ran off the edges in thin streams. If I come back, she said slowly, everything changes. Yes. I become Rosalind again. I have to face all of it, my brother. The ton, all the things that happened. Yes. And if it goes wrong, I lose everything, the estate, my name, my freedom. It won't go wrong, he said. She gave him a look. You can't know that. No, but I can tell you that I will not let it go wrong. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said everything important. I have let a lot of things go wrong in my life, Rosalind. I let you disappear and then let myself be talked into believing you were gone. I will not let anything else go wrong. Not if I can stop it. She was looking at him with those gray eyes, and the firelight was moving over her face, and she looked so much like herself, and so much like someone different from herself all at once. And he thought that whoever she had become out here in the wild, whoever Wren was, she was not less than Rosalind. She was perhaps more. She had survived things that would have broken most people. She had built a life with her hands in a forest in the winter. She had been afraid every day and had survived anyway. I need to think, she said finally. I know. More than one day. Take whatever time you need. She nodded slowly. Then she looked at the fire. Then she looked back at him. You're still soaked, she said. It's fine. You're going to get sick. I assure you it is very difficult to get me sick. She reached over and handed him one of the folded skins from the pile. It was not a grand gesture. It was completely practical. But he took it and draped it over his shoulders and sat by her fire in her shelter in the middle of the thornwood while the rain fell outside, and something settled between them that was neither quite the thing they had been 3 years ago, nor anything he had a word for yet, but was, he thought, something real. He continued coming every morning. She did not give him an answer, and he did not ask for one. They had fallen into a routine that felt both fragile and strangely solid, like ice on a river that will hold your weight if you move carefully. He brought food. He sat with her. They talked, sometimes for a long time and sometimes hardly at all. And he read to her, and she showed him, once, how she had set her trap lines, very practical and direct about it, demonstrating with the kind of quiet expertise that 3 years of necessity had built in her. And he watched and paid attention, and tried not to think about the fact that she had had to learn these things alone. He told her things too. He had not planned to. It had not been a strategy. It had simply happened over the course of those morning visits that he found himself saying things he had never said to anyone. He told her about the 2 years after she disappeared, what they had been like. He was honest about it, not sparing himself. He told her he had handled it badly, had become colder and more withdrawn than he had already been, and had pushed away most of the people who might have helped him. He told her about his sister Constance coming to Ravemore House the second winter, and refusing to leave until he had eaten a proper meal and spoken more than 6 words to her, and how he had been furious about it, and how he was now very grateful. Rosalind listened to all of this without saying much, but she listened closely. He could tell. On the 14th day, she said, "Tell me about my brother." He had been expecting this question. He had been careful not to bring it up again, letting her come to it in her own time. And now she had. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "What is he doing? How does he live? What has he done with the estate?" Edmund thought about how to say what he knew. He sold the Ashworth townhouse in London 2 years ago. He has mortgaged the Yorkshire estate significantly. He paused. He is not a good manager. The estate is not in good condition. Her jaw tightened. "My father's estate." "Yes." "My grandfather built that house." She said it very quietly. "My mother planted the garden there. She spent 30 years in that garden." "I know," he said, though he hadn't known about the garden specifically. He filed it away. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What will you do if I agree?" "The first thing is a letter to my solicitor in London, a man named Hartley, who is one of the best men I know and who will handle the legal aspects quietly and efficiently. The second thing is sending for a doctor, a man named Fielding, who is my personal physician and who is completely trustworthy. He will need to examine you and certify your health and identity." He watched her face carefully. "The third thing, once those 2 things are in place, is writing formally to your brother to inform him that his sister is alive and that the matter of the estate will be revisited under law. That letter will be sent simultaneously with a letter to 2 members of Parliament and the Lord Chief Justice, so that your brother cannot act before the matter is already, essentially, public record. She nodded slowly. You have thought about this a great deal. I have thought about very little else for 2 weeks, he said frankly. She almost smiled. And after all of that, he said, you reclaim your name, your estate, and your life. Whatever you decide to do with them is entirely your own business. She looked at him sharply at that. My own business, she repeated. Yes. He held her gaze. I am not trying to create an obligation or a debt or anything of that kind. I want you to be safe and to have what is rightfully yours. Whatever you choose to do after that is your decision. She studied him for a moment. You are very different from how I remembered you, she said. In what way? You were always, she searched for the word, controlled. Everything is very measured, very correct. You frightened me a little, actually. He blinked. He had not known that. I frightened you. Not badly, it was more, you seemed very certain of everything, very decided, and I never quite knew what you thought of me, specifically. Whether I was simply the appropriate sort of person to be considering for a duchess, or whether... She stopped. Whether I saw you, he said. She nodded. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the terrible poetry he had burned. I saw you, he said. I simply was not very good at showing it. He paused. I am told I have improved somewhat. You have, she said, quietly, with a certainty that made something warm move through his chest. She came to a decision on the 16th day. He arrived in the morning as usual, and she was waiting at the edge of the clearing rather than arriving after him, which was new. She was standing very straight, her hands at her sides, her chin up. She had tried, he could see, to do something with her hair, to tame it somewhat, though the forest had a way of claiming it back. All right, she said when he was close enough. All right, I'll do it. He nodded. He did not make a speech. He did not reach for her or do anything dramatic. He simply said, Good. I'll send the letters today. She let out a breath. It was a long breath, like something she had been holding for a very long time. I need a few days to prepare myself, she said, before I come out of the forest to be Rosalind again. Take as many days as you need, he said, but in the meantime I want you to come to the house. She looked at him. Not into the main house if you are not ready for that, he said quickly. There is a cottage at the eastern edge of the forest. My estate manager uses it in summer. It is empty now, it is warm and dry and stocked, and it is the most private building on the estate. No one goes there except Dobbins, and I will tell Dobbins to stay away. You can come and go from the forest as you like. It is simply a better option than the shelter for the weeks it will take to set things in motion legally. She was thinking it over. He could see her turning it from side to side, at looking for the danger in it. Just the cottage, he said. Nothing else is required. No one needs to know you are there. Your housekeeper. I will manage my housekeeper. Your staff. I will manage my staff. He met her eyes. I am a duke. Managing people who work for me is more or less my primary skill. She almost smiled again. It was becoming slightly easier to find that almost smile. The cottage, she said at last. Yes. All right. He nodded. I will have it ready by tomorrow morning. The cottage was ready by the next morning. He had handled it himself with the help of only his housekeeper, Mrs. Yarrow, who was 63 years old and had worked for the Ravemore family for 40 of those years, and who looked at Edmund when he gave her the quiet, careful instructions and said simply, "Yes, Your Grace," without a single question asked. He loved Mrs. Yarrow enormously and had never told her so. Rosalind moved into the cottage on the 18th day after he had first seen her in the forest. He did not accompany her. He simply told her it was ready and showed her where the key was and left her to go at her own pace. She went alone in the early morning with the small collection of things she had made or gathered over 3 years. Her clay pots, her trap lines, her knife, the tin pot he had brought her, the blanket, the gloves. She had very little, and she carried it all. He did not offer to carry any of it. He sent his first letter to Hartley, the solicitor, that same afternoon. The next 2 weeks were complicated in ways he had mostly anticipated, and a few ways he had not. Hartley wrote back within 4 days, swift and efficient, setting out a clear plan of action. Dr. Fielding arrived from London within a week, examined Rosalind in the cottage with Mrs. Yarrow present as a matter of propriety, and produced a signed document certifying her identity and the excellent condition of her physical and mental health, with a note about the healed fracture in her left arm and the scar on her jaw that was consistent with the carriage accident of December 1821. This document was then witnessed by 2 local magistrates who were Edmund's neighbors and who owed him enough dinners to be reliably cooperative. Edmund wrote to Lord Ashworth. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. It informed Viscount Ashworth that his sister, Lady Rosalind Ashworth, was alive and in residence at Ravemore House in Northumberland, that she was in full health, that she had been medically certified and legally identified, that she would be coming forward to reclaim her name and her inheritance, and that copies of all relevant documentation had been sent to the Lord Chief Justice, 2 members of Parliament, and Ashworth's own solicitor in London. There was no room in the letter for maneuver. There was no language that left a gap through which a man might try to slip. Edmund had worked on those 3 paragraphs for 2 days, and Hartley had worked on them for another day, and the result was a letter as tight as a locked door. He told Rosalind he had sent it before it went. She had taken the news very quietly, sitting in the cottage with a cup of tea in both hands, looking at the fire. She had been slowly settling into the cottage the way a person settles into something unfamiliar. Carefully, without committing too much of yourself until you are sure it is safe. She had started sleeping on the bed rather than on the floor after the 3rd night. She had started using the kitchen. She had spent one afternoon, he discovered later from Mrs. Yarrow, who had been sworn to total discretion, asking the housekeeper if she might have some flour and eggs, and then producing a loaf of bread that Mrs. Yarrow described as the best she had tasted in 30 years, which Edmund thought was perhaps an exaggeration but was clearly some sort of milestone. "He will fight it," Rosalind said, when he told her the letter had been sent. "He can try," Edmund said. She set down the cup. He will come here. He is not welcome on my estate. His coming here without invitation is trespassing, and I will make that very clear in language he understands. She shook her head slowly. You make it sound simple. No, he said. I know it isn't simple. It is going to be difficult and unpleasant, and it may take months to fully resolve the legal situation. But none of that difficulty and unpleasantness is going to touch you here. I need you to believe that. She looked at him for a long moment. She had lost a little of the wildness in the past 2 weeks. Her hair was clean now and pinned up in a simple way, and she was wearing a dress that had been sourced with remarkable diplomacy by Mrs. Yarrow from the wardrobe of Edmund's cousin, who had left a few things behind after a summer visit 2 years ago. The dress was plain and dark blue, and it fit well enough. She looked like herself more and more, though there were still moments when she would go very still and her eyes would go elsewhere, and he knew she was back in the forest, or back in the ravine, or back in some moment from the 3 years that she had not yet told him all of. I don't understand why you are doing this, she said. He looked at her steadily. You know why? Tell me. Not a challenge, genuinely asking. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about all the things he might say and all the things he was still afraid to say, and then he thought about 3 years of looking at a gravestone and decided that perhaps he had been afraid of quite enough things for quite long enough. Because I have been in love with you since the summer I came to Ashworth, he said. I handled it poorly at the time because I was 23 and an idiot. And then you were gone, and I spent 3 years being fairly convinced I had missed the only opportunity I was ever going to have to say anything worth saying. He held her gaze. And then I found you alive in my forest, and I decided I was not going to waste whatever chance I have been given by whatever combination of providence and stubbornness brought me to that clearing. She was very still. Her hands were in her lap, and she was looking at him with an expression he could not read, which was unusual because he was generally quite good at reading her by now. Edmund, she said very softly. You don't have to say anything, he said. Not now. Not about that. I only told you because it seemed important that you know it is not about duty or rescue or anything of that kind. It is about the fact that you are the most remarkable person I have ever met. And that was true 3 years ago when you still wore properly fitted dresses and attended dinner parties. And it is perhaps even more true now that I have watched you survive things that would have destroyed most people. She was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled in the little cottage hearth, so outside the October wind was getting cold again. Then she said, I used to dream about you. He blinked. In the forest, she said. Those first months when it was still very bad, I would dream about that summer, and you were in the dreams, not always saying anything, just there. She looked down at her hands. I used to wake up, and it would take me a moment to remember where I was, and in that moment I would think, I should tell Edmund about this. And then I would remember that you didn't know I was alive. She swallowed. I missed you, which surprised me because I had not realized when it was happening how much of you I had already. She stopped. He waited. She looked up. I am not ready, she said carefully, to say everything. There is too much still, unsettled, in me and outside of me. But I want you to know that I don't. That your doing this is not nothing to me. You are not nothing to me. It was not a declaration. It was far from a declaration, but he thought of it as perhaps the bravest thing he had heard anyone say in a very long time, given how much she had lost by trusting people, given how carefully she had been protecting herself. That, he said, with the smallest possible hint of something that was not quite a smile but was trying to be, is more than enough. Lord Ashworth arrived at the Ravemore estate gate on the 3rd of November. He had not come quietly. He had come with his own solicitor, and with a man Edmund did not recognize, and with a manner that his gatekeeper described afterward as extremely unpleasant. Edmund was at the gate to meet him, having been informed by his footman that a carriage had been seen on the North Road an hour earlier. He stood at the gate and looked at his distant cousin's cousin, this man who had arranged the murder of his own sister for money, and felt something very cold move through him. Ashworth was younger than Edmund by 3 years, with the look of a man who had once been handsome, and had spent those years spending that handsomeness down to the dregs. He was pale and overdressed, and his eyes were moving too quickly, the way eyes move when a man is frightened and trying not to show it. "Calloway," Ashworth said from inside the carriage. "Lord Ashworth," Edmund said, flat and cold and final as a door closing. "You are not welcome on this estate, so I would ask you to turn around. I have come to see my sister. Your sister does not wish to see you. She has made that extremely clear through her solicitor, whose name you have and through whom all further communication should be directed." Ashworth's face went red. This is outrageous. You can't just—" "I can, as a matter of fact," Edmund said. "You are on my land without my invitation. If you do not leave within the next 5 minutes, I will send for the local magistrate, who is, as it happens, a personal friend of mine and a thorough and diligent man who, I understand, has been taking quite an interest in the details of your sister's carriage accident of December 1821. The color left Ashworth's face. "The road," Edmund said, "is that way." The carriage turned around. Edmund stood at the gate and watched it go, and then stood there for another minute after it had disappeared, letting the cold move through him and then out of him. Then he turned and walked back up to the house. Rosalind was waiting for him at the door of the cottage. She had seen the carriage from the window. Her face was very pale, and her hands were clenched at her sides, and she was standing very straight in the way she stood when she was frightened and refusing to let it show. He walked up to her and stopped a few feet away. "He's gone," he said. She let out a long, slow breath. Her hands were unclenched. She looked at him. And then she did something that surprised him. She reached out and took his hand, just held it, both her hands around his for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He did not say anything. He simply stood there and let her hold his hand in the cold November air outside the cottage, and thought that 3 years was a very long time to love someone in silence, and that silence sometimes was finished. November in Northumberland was a quiet month. The business of the legal case moved forward with the slow, grinding thoroughness of the law, which was maddening in its pace and very effective in its results. Hartley was excellent. The magistrate, as Edmund had suggested, was thorough. Lord Ashworth's solicitor in London made several attempts to complicate matters and succeeded mostly in annoying everyone involved and slowing things by about 2 weeks. In the end, it did not matter. The evidence was clear, the witnesses were credible, the medical documentation was impeccable, and the 2 members of Parliament whom Edmund had quietly informed of the situation were both the kind of men who found the idea of a viscount arranging the murder of his own sister for an inheritance both morally appalling and professionally interesting. By the middle of November, Lord Ashworth had quietly engaged a very expensive barrister to attempt a negotiation, which Hartley described to Edmund in his letter as the most transparent piece of damage control he had seen in 30 years of practice. The estate in Yorkshire would be returned to Rosalind. The townhouse in London was already sold, and that money was complicated, but Hartley was hopeful. The mortgages would be addressed. It would take time, but Rosalind would have her inheritance back. The law was, in this case, on the side of the living. As for Lord Ashworth himself, the question of criminal charges was a harder thing. Edmund talked to Rosalind about it carefully and honestly, laying out what the options were and what the likely outcomes of each would be. She listened carefully, asked sharp questions, and then was quiet for a long time. "I want him to know that I am alive," she said finally. "I want him to understand that everything he did was for nothing. That he failed." She paused. "A trial would be. I would have to be in London. I would have to speak publicly, and I am not." She stopped. "I am not ready for London yet. I am not ready for all of that." "You don't have to be," Edmund said. "But the justice, the loss of the estate and the income and the position he has built on your supposed death," Edmund said carefully, "is a significant consequence. It is not the only consequence possible, but it is a real one." He watched her. "And the question of criminal charges does not have to be decided today or even this year. It can be held in reserve, used as a reminder to him of how careful he ought to be." She looked at him, a sword over his head. "A very well-documented sword," he agreed. Something in her face settled, not happy exactly, but certain. "Yes," she said. "All right." "Yes." She had been writing letters during those November weeks. She wrote to 2 friends from before, carefully worded letters that explained nothing yet and everything at once, saying only that she was alive and well and would be in contact more fully when she was able. She wrote a letter to the Barker family, the farmer and his wife who had sheltered her after the accident, a long letter, and Edmund understood from the way she looked while writing it that these were people she cared for and was grateful to, and he made a note to himself to find out what, concretely, he could do for them. She wrote to Constance. He found out about this from Constance herself, who appeared at Ravemore House on the 15th of November in a carriage with her baronet husband, and an expression of such barely contained emotion that Edmund's butler, a man of great composure, actually stepped back half a step. "Where is she?" Constance said before she was even fully through the door. "Good morning, Constance," Edmund said. "Edmund Arthur Calloway. Where is she?" He brought his sister to the cottage. He let them have an hour alone. When he knocked and entered, Constance was crying, openly and without apparent embarrassment, and Rosalind was not crying, but her eyes were very bright and she had Constance's hand held in both of hers. Constance looked up at Edmund and then back at Rosalind and then back at Edmund and said with the particular sternness that only sisters achieve, "You had better not make a mess of this." "I will do my very best," he said with great dignity. Rosalind made a sound that was unambiguously a laugh. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. It was, frankly, the best sound he had heard in 3 years, and he understood in that moment, in a way he had suspected but not quite known, that everything that was about to come was going to be all right. Not perfect. Not simple. But all right. The weeks that followed had a different quality to them. Rosalind was still in the cottage, which was, by this point, say a temporary arrangement that was beginning to feel less and less temporary in the most particular way. She had started coming to the main house for dinner, at first just herself and Edmund and Mrs. Yarrow, hovering anxiously in the background, and then with Constance and her baronet, and then once with 2 of Edmund's neighbors who had known Rosalind before, and who received the news of her survival with such immediate and unperformed joy that it stripped away some layer of her guardedness that had been in place since the beginning. She started going into the village. This was her idea, and she did it first alone, early in the morning, which Edmund learned about afterward, and which made him want to say several things that he did not say, because she was not a person who needed his permission to go into the village, and he knew that, and he had in fact been making quite deliberate efforts to ensure that none of his care for her looked anything like control, given everything she had survived and everything she had said about her brother. She went into the village and talked to the woman at the bakery, and bought a small bag of dried apples and walked back. And when she told him about it that evening, she looked both pleased with herself and slightly surprised at being pleased with herself, the way someone looks when they have done something they were afraid of, and found it manageable after all. He took her riding one afternoon in late November. He had asked her properly, a few days ahead of time, and she had said yes with a firmness that suggested she had been wanting to ask herself, and was glad he had. He had a mare ready for her, a quiet gray one named Pearl, and he watched Rosalind approach the horse with that same careful, sure-footed confidence she brought to everything physical, and thought, again, that 3 years in the wild had made her in some ways more herself, not less, had stripped away the parts of her that had been performing ease, and left only the parts that were genuinely at ease, which were different parts and more interesting ones. They rode north, up to the edge of the moors, where the land opened up and the sky went enormous and the wind came off the hills cold and clean. They did not talk much. They rode side by side, and the horses were comfortable together, and the afternoon light was thin and gold, and he was aware, in a way that was almost unbearable in how simple it was, that this was the happiest he had been in years. I've been thinking, she said after a long, quiet stretch. About what? About the estate in Yorkshire. She was looking at the horizon. I want to go back there. When the legal business is finished, I want to see what he's done with it and decide what I want to do. Of course, he said. It may take a long time to put it right. It may cost more than the income from the land for a while. Hartley has some ideas about that, if you want to talk to him. She nodded. I do. A pause. And I want to hire someone to restore my mother's garden. I will find you the best gardener in England, he said immediately. She glanced at him sideways. You don't have to do that. I want to do that, he said simply. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with that gray-eyed steadiness. Then she said, You know that there are things that are not finished in me. From the last 3 years, I am still, she searched for the word, still finding the edges of it, of what I can do and what I still can't, of who I am now versus who I was. I know, he said, I am not ready to make certain kinds of decisions. Not yet. I need time. I am not asking you to make any decisions, he said with complete sincerity. I told you weeks ago. Whatever happens after you have your life back is your own business. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved her hair. Pearl shifted beneath her, and she settled the horse with a quiet hand. I think, she said slowly, like someone reading something aloud as they find the words, that I would like it to be our business. Eventually. When I am ready, she paused. If you still, I am not going anywhere, he said quietly. She nodded. And then, for the first time, she looked at him with something fully open in her face. No wall up, no guard, just her, just Rosalind, looking at him in the afternoon light on the top of the moor, and he thought that whatever she was now, this person who had lived through the ravine and the winter and the long silence and all the small daily courage of 3 years alone in the thornwood, she was extraordinary. He did not say this. He had said enough important things recently, and he thought this one could wait for a better moment. There were going to be better moments. He was fairly certain of that now. They rode back as the sun was dropping, the sky going pink at the edges, and then gray, the lights of Ravemore House appearing below them in the valley as they came down off the moor. It was a good house, Edmund had always thought so, though he had also always thought of it as a house that was slightly too large and too quiet for one person. Tonight, with 2 sets of hoofbeats on the drive, and the warm light coming from the cottage window, and Mrs. Yarrow visible in the kitchen window, the house looked different. It looked like something that could be filled. He helped Rosalind down from Pearl in the stable yard, which she accepted with slightly less resistance than she had accepted any similar help before, which he took as a very small and genuine sign of progress. She stood in the yard and looked up at the house. It's a good house, she said. I have always thought so, he agreed. It needs more roses. He blinked. Does it? Along the south wall. There's a whole section of south-facing wall that gets afternoon sun and has nothing on it. She sounded authoritative about this. Roses would do very well there. Then we shall have roses, he said. She looked at him, and there it was again, fuller this time, the almost smile that had been becoming slowly and surely over these past weeks. An actual smile, warm and real, and entirely her own. She held it for a moment. Then she said, "Good night, Edmund," and walked across the yard to the cottage. He stood in the stable yard for a moment and breathed the cold night air. "Good night, Edmund." 3 years ago she had been alive in a ravine in the dark, and he had not known it. She had built a shelter with her own hands and survived 2 winters and kept herself whole through sheer determined will. And then, one October morning, he had ridden into his own forest and found her crouching beside an oak tree with her hair full of leaves, watching him with those storm-gray eyes. And he had said her name. He went inside. There were letters to write. Hartley needed an update, and there were arrangements to be made for when Rosalind was ready to go to Yorkshire. And there was a list of English gardeners he intended to start compiling because he had promised the best one in England, and he did not make promises he did not keep. He settled at his desk and opened his writing case and picked up his pen. Then he set the pen down and simply sat for a moment. Outside, across the yard, a light was on in the cottage window. He could see it from where he sat. It was the only light on that side of the house, small and warm in the November dark. She was alive. She had been alive for 3 years, and now she was 40 yards away in his cottage with her dried apple collection and her clay pots and her tin pot and her extraordinary stubbornness. And tomorrow morning he would walk across the yard and knock on the door, and she would open it, and they would have breakfast, and there would be a conversation about legal documents and Yorkshire and possibly roses. And then another day would pass and another, and each day would be its own thing. Its own small accumulation of ordinary moments that were not ordinary at all, that were each of them a gift, and he was going to pay attention to every single one. He picked up the pen and began to write. In the thornwood, the great oaks stood in the dark, and the frost settled on the fallen log in the clearing, and the shelter built of branches and bark and bracken waited empty in the night, already becoming part of the forest again, the way all things eventually return to what holds them. The trap lines were gone. The fire had long since gone cold. What had been a home for 3 years was now just a place in the woods. Rosalind was not in the woods anymore. She was 40 yards away in a warm cottage, writing letters and eating dried apples and deciding, slowly and on her own terms, who she was going to be next. She was alive, and she was learning how to be Rosalind again, without losing Wren, without giving back the things she had earned, without pretending the 3 years had not happened or that the river had not shaped her into something new. She was doing it carefully, the way she did everything now, the way someone moves across ice, trusting it, testing it, going steady. Edmund finished his letter, sealed it, and set it on the tray for the morning post. Then he went to the window that looked south across the yard toward the cottage. The light was still on. He looked at it for a moment, and then, Oh, for the first time in 3 years, he did not feel the familiar ache of absence that had lived in his chest since December of 1821. He felt instead something quieter and more solid and more real than that. Something like the beginning of something. Something like a door that had been shut for a very long time, beginning carefully, slowly, in its own time, to open. He let the curtain fall and went to bed. England. There were roses to plant.